Okay. Good evening and welcome to Artist Talk on Art on Monday, October 16th, 2023. I'm Doug Shear, President of Artist Talk on Art. This Zoom event is recorded and copyrighted by Artist Talk on Art and will soon be added to our Artist Talk on Art YouTube channel. Next week, October 23rd at 7 p.m., AI and Art, Tool or Threat. You can see details of who's appearing on the website. And if you're getting our emails, as many of you are, you'll see the details there. Bound to be a very exciting and perhaps even challenging sort of debate. Don't miss it. I'd like to mention that 2024 will mark Artist Talk on Art's 50th anniversary year. We have some excitement in store, including a gala in May, an auction event, and some publishing projects. So it's quite an exciting moment for us, and we hope that you will join us or even be part of it. If you're interested, just get in touch with us and let us know. Tonight, we feature the renowned sculptor and hand archive founder, Vanessa Hoheb, who will be interviewed by the artist Helaine Soller. And now a few words about Helaine. Born and raised in New York, Helaine holds degrees from Pratt Institute, a BFA in advertising design, and Queens College, an MS in art education. She studied with Jacob Lawrence at the New School, in master classes with Jerome Witkin and Eric Fischel, and at the Art Students League. Her lifelong career in painting parallels her achievements as an artist, art educator, and art activist, also as a curator. Helaine Soller's work is included in many collections, among them the print and photographic division of the Library of Congress, the National Museum of Women in the Arts archive, and numerous public and private collections. Her work has been shown in 26 solo and over 200 group shows, nationally and internationally, including Tokyo, Japan, and Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia, including museums, art galleries, corporate galleries, colleges, and universities. Museum exhibits include the Volker Orth Museum, a solo exhibition, MoMA PS1, Long Island Museum at Stony Brook, the Queens Museum, the Bronx Museum, the Arkell Museum of Anthropology of the People of New York, and much more. And now it's my pleasure to turn things over to Helaine Soller to introduce Vanessa Hoheb. Helaine.
Thank you, Doug. It's a pleasure to be able to present Vanessa Hoheb, who is to this most prestigious organization and audience. Thank you for organizing this presentation, and I appreciate this opportunity to present. Vanessa will take you on a most fascinating journey of her achievements, the story of her life's work. It's a unique story of great passion and scope, embracing the fields of sculpture, casting, and restoration, while contributing to contemporary art history and art education. Vanessa Hoheb is the founder and director of the American Artists' Hands Archive. She is documenting in bronze life castings of the hands of many of America's most influential visual artists. Ongoing collection is a sponsored project of the New York Foundation of the Arts and a recipient of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund grant. A collection is on view at the DR Center Gallery in Tarrytown, New York. Vanessa began her apprenticeship at the age of 17 in the New York sculpture studio of her father, sculptor Bruce Hoheb. Mastering the skills and techniques of sculptural enlargement, mold making, casting, and restoration, she worked with clients William de Kooning, Louise Nevelson, and Jasper Johns. She joined the Metropolitan Museum as the assistant director of the reproduction studio in 1975, making molds and masters of original objects. Vanessa led the Hoheb studio team responsible for restoring the skin of the Statue of Liberty.
Interesting.
She made molds over the statue's nose, eyes, hair, and where corrosion had punctured holes in the copper surface. These molds were utilized by the coppersmiths to make replacement patches for the damaged areas. At Pratt, she taught mold making and casting to students in many disciplines. Vanessa joined the Polich Tallix Fine Art Foundry as the technical liaison for the artists whose work was cast and fabricated there. She also managed the restoration and conservation divisions during her 17 years at the foundry. She currently oversees the production of works for Frank Stella, Mary Frank, and William Tucker, and lectures at Marist College and the School of Visual Arts, and is the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York. It is my great pleasure to present Vanessa Hoheb.
Thank you, Helaine. I think my work is done.
Yeah.
It's never done. You go on to greatness.
When I was reading about this wonderful program that you've had, which is now coming on to its 50th anniversary, I was looking at the list of panelists you've had over the years, and I really have to say I'm quite humbled to be part of this lineup, and I'm going to do my best to be good value, and hopefully you'll enjoy the time we have together. But I do thank you so much for this invitation. It's a real honor for me to be with you. I think the place to begin with my story is the telling of my father's story. My father, Bruce Hoheb, grew up in New York City, and he got his degree in civil engineering at Columbia University in the 1950s. When he married my mother, he was drawn into her family's construction business, and he quickly went through the ranks of laborer to master bricklayer to construction foreman to master bricklayer. But his real passion was sculpture and art, and he knew that it would be impossible to raise a family with 4 children in this way. He spent many hours in what he always referred to as stolen moments at the Art Students League in New York, studying, carving, drawing. And while he was there, he met an old timer at the Art Students League, a fellow who befriended him and told him about this trade of sculptural enlarging. The guy told him that there were only about 7 sculptural enlargers in this country. They were all getting on in years. They didn't have assistants per se. And he said, you know, Hoheb, you have a good sense of form. You have a good eye. With your degree in civil engineering, you're obviously a good mechanic. And if you have the ability to work on other people's work, you could be in the allied trades. The man said to him, form is form.
Love to know who that was.
While you're working on other people's work, you will be training your hand and your eye.
Mhm.
And it's like a pianist playing the scales all day. You're doing this work all day long, but at night when you go into the studio to do your own work, you will have arrived. You don't have to spend that time anymore. You will have already been training your hand and your eye. So my father went to the studio of a sculptural enlarger who had a machine, a tool downtown. And he looked at the work that was in progress. And he went home and he built his own enlarging machine, as you do. This image on the left shows the three-dimensional pantograph that he built and used for many years. And what happened was the word got out that he was doing this work, and the work came in from the local foundries, and he found himself out of construction and into the allied trades of sculpture. The old timer told him being in the allied trades will keep you connected to the art world. And that old timer's name was Jacques Lipschitz. And it proved to be very good advice. So the work of Hoheb Studios was sculptural enlarging and mold making and casting. And I'm trying to advance. I have a little thing here that says, okay. So this is what a 17-year-old kid looks like in front of an enlarging machine. The following years were very, very busy. We worked on many different types of enlargements, and it really ranged in the diversity of the artists that came to the studio. Sometimes the work would come to the foundry, from the foundry. Other times it would come from the artists. Often they would ask us to enlarge their pieces into clay, and then they would do the final modeling. And sometimes we would do the final modeling. But I always loved the mess of it and the structure of it. And my father taught me how to weld and apply the clay and to mix plaster. I always loved working on horse animal enlargements because they just they always broke themselves down into very clean components. You always did the head separately and the legs separately and the body separately. So what you're seeing in the foreground is the hard model, the plaster maquette, and then obviously the enlarged section of the horse in the background. We did a series of enlargements for Marshall Fredericks, and it was our task to do the final modeling. So here you see the maquette is on the left side, and the enlargement covered with cardboard is on the right. We would always work from the inside out, building the armature out of steel and wood, and then covering it with cardboard, and then finally covering it with clay. And in the case of the Marshall Fredericks sculptures, we did the modeling for him. Ultimately, once the clay in plastiline was completed, then it was our job, whether we did the modeling or the artist came to our studio to do it, then we would make another type of mold and then translate the clay into a hard material, usually plaster, later fiberglass, and then we would give that model to the foundry. So we always acted as this intermediary between the artists and the foundries. Sculptural enlarging is always has always been a very traditional behind the scenes type of work. It's been going on for centuries. And I know that one of the reasons my father was so successful at Hoheb Studios doing work for other artists is because he had what I've come to refer to as the ego, the discipline of ego, where he was able to work for other sculptors without leaving fingerprints of his own. And he took that role in honor and very seriously. And then when it was time for him to do his own sculpture, he would put on his artist hat. And that has been one of the great lessons of my life, growing up in the studio as a sculpture technician. I've always embraced that time-honored role, and I've always enjoyed, I've enjoyed the work, obviously, but I accepted my role as a behind-the-scenes person whose name was never on the work, and that was a very fine place to be. It was a respectable, honorable place to be. When Frederick Hart was given the commission, Frederick Hart started out as a stone carver at the Washington Cathedral as a young man, and he was given a commission of carving in limestone a huge bas-relief. The sculpture called Ex Nihilo, From the Void, was his version of the creation. And Frederick Hart came to our studio with a small maquette. It was only about 4 or 5 feet high, and the task was to enlarge it in many, many sections. And then we brought the enlargement sections down to Rick's studio in Washington, and it took him about 2 years to do the modeling. When Rick was done with the modeling, we went down to Washington, and then we made plaster molds over the entire sculpture and plaster casts, which we did in sections, obviously. And then we brought the plaster casts over to the cathedral and set the whole sculpture up in situ so that the stone carvers could use the one-to-one plaster model as their reference for the carving in stone. So the next time you're in Washington, you really want to see this stunning work. The mold making and the casting of it took about 6 weeks on site. And as you can see from my sorry looking face, it was an exhausting task, just physical labor all day long, but it was a beautiful sculpture, and I'm very honored to have been part of that. William de Kooning came to our studio with a series of bronzes. He had modeled these sculptures when he was in Italy in about 1969. He was just sitting on a park bench in Rome, and he modeled these pieces very quickly, very fluidly in clay. He took them to a friend of his in the Roman foundry, and they cast them in bronze. And what you see on the screen here are the 6 bronze pieces. They're about 6 inches tall. They're very small. And they sat on a shelf for many, many years. A friend of his, Henry Moore, had suggested to Kooning that he enlarge them, but Bill wasn't into it at the time. So they sat on a shelf for 20 some odd years until Bill de Kooning's gallerist, Xavier Fourcade, said, it's time to enlarge these pieces. So they chose 3 pieces: the figure at the very top of the screen, the seated woman, and the figure to its immediate right, which is the standing figure. And the figure at the bottom left was the reclining figure. So the idea was to enlarge these 3 pieces to heroic scale and cast them in bronze. And this is what the seated woman looks like as a finished bronze. This was taken at Bill's studio out in the Hamptons after the work was done. The entire project took about 3 years to do. We did all 3 enlargements, the mold making and the casting, concurrently. And the standing figure, as this is 12 foot tall. And the reclining figure, which was 13 foot wide and about 6 foot tall. In this image, I'm holding the original scale piece. Going from 6 inches tall to 12 feet tall is about a 16 times multiplication. And because de Kooning was well into his 80s at the time, it was determined that we would not only enlarge the sculptures, but also do the final modeling under his direction. When pieces are enlarged, they change. And it's up to the artist to decide what changes are important to them, what has to be modified as you go through these changes in scale. So we determined that we would enlarge the piece 4 times to the scale of what you see, the white sculpture to my, well, to left or right, is the intermediary size. That's 4 times larger than the piece I'm holding in my hand. And the sculpture behind it, the full-size piece, is 4 times larger again. And what you're looking at in this image is plastiline over a welded steel armature. Ultimately, we had to build the armature so that it would support the weight of a mold. But it was very daunting to know that we had to do the modeling for de Kooning's work. So this intermediary size was a critical way to understand his intention. It's one thing to enlarge a piece accurately with the pantograph machine, but then it's the artist's job, the sculptor's job, to breathe the life back into it, if you will. And when Bill was modeling these pieces on the park bench, there was a certain speed and dexterity and energy that he imbued into the sculpture. And it was our task to refine that energy in the form of the enlarged surfaces. So to have the intermediary size, to get our heads around it, get the vocabulary, understand what a big thumb would do, this was a critical stage. De Kooning would come to our studio when we were finished with the modeling, and he would check the clay. We would do refinements under his direction, and it was very successful. His wife Helaine de Kooning would come with him, and there were times when she would point out areas that we missed, and I remember her telling me a few times, look at this area here. It looks a little flat. It looks a little dead. You have to keep thinking about what a big thumb would do. And little dead. What's that? What did you say? Oh. So I learned what a big thumb would do. And once the modeling was done and approved, then the technical task came back to us in terms of making a massive multi-piece plaster mold over the sculpture. And into that plaster mold, we would cast a hollow fiberglass. The fiberglass, so here in this image, I'm holding all 3 sculptures. All 3 are in resin. When Bill gave me the original bronze, the first thing I did was made a mold over it and made a hard model to use as the master. Then I enlarged it in clay to the intermediary size. Once that was approved, I made another mold and a resin cast, and then we went into the clay and then into the fiberglass. So you can see why this whole project times 3 sculptures took 3 years. It was a very intense period. I don't remember any other sculptures going through the studio during those times. This is a shot of taking the finished standing woman in hollow fiberglass up to the foundry. When Tallix foundry was first started, Dick Polich was in Peekskill, New York, on the river. And during that 3-year period, as the bronzes were happening and the enlargements were being delivered, Dick Polich moved his foundry to Beacon, New York, and then subsequently to Newburgh, New York. But a wonderful thing happened on the first piece. I don't know if you can see this, but when we were inscribing, I had Bill write his name on a piece of paper, and then I enlarged it to the scale that it should be for the heroic size piece. And I turned to Helaine and I said, you know, when I go around the city and I see many of the old time heroic pieces, I often see, in addition to the foundry's inscription, I see the enlarger's name. May we put our name on it? And she said, I insist. So the whole series, I think there were 3 of each of the heroic size bronzes, all have Hoheb Studios New York, and I'm very proud of that. Shortly after that, Louise Nevelson brought this delightful sculpture to our studio. The terracotta piece was only about 20 inches tall. And what she wanted was a 6-foot tall enlargement. And ultimately, she didn't want it cast in bronze, but she wanted it into black fiberglass, hollow black fiberglass, very lightweight. And she wanted us to put little wheels underneath it so she could race it around the studio, which she did. And I love the piece. I love the fact that I was doing a sculpture with Louise Nevelson. And she also said, I'll want you to do the final modeling, because she also at the time was well into her 80s. And I looked at the textures and the surfaces on this beautiful terracotta, and I had so much fun.
The sound just disappeared.
You're muted, Vanessa.
Vanessa,
You're
you
muted.
muted yourself.
How's that? Am I back?
Yes, you are.
Okay. So I had a wonderful time making these tools that enabled me to do the final modeling that would replicate Louise's texture in the original sculpture. And I have to tell you, I did a great job. I was really proud of it. And Louise came to the studio to see the clay. And she was looking around. She wanted to describe some refinements she wanted. And she was looking around, and I just handed her a pencil and pointed to the large plasterboard wall. And she started drawing on the wall. And she said, great, you did a fabulous job. It was 20 inches tall. It's 6 feet tall now, and it's a different sculpture. What I want you to do is I want you to take all the texture out and make these edges that you so carefully made wiggly, just like the original, and I want them to become straight. And I want all the planes to become flat. I want it to look as though it was made of rough-hewn granite and assembled and then slightly dropped. And she was talking as she was drawing on the wall. And I understood my instructions, and then she was done. And I turned to her and I said, would you sign this? And she wrote self-portrait Nevelson on it. And years later, when my father and I left the studio, I took my Sawzall and I cut this out of the wall. And I have it to this day. I have it, and I just love it.
Was
So I
that
brought,
on view? Was that
What's that?
recently on, was that recently on view in the Museum of Modern Art, I think?
I don't know, the 6-foot version of
I'm
the,
not, I think
I
the
don't know.
smaller was something in, I think it was in between, I'm not sure.
I don't know. It was a one-off piece, and after I brought it to her studio and cast it, I never heard of it again. But I took the clay, once I finished the refinements to the clay as she described them to me, I put the clay enlargement in the back of my pickup truck, which I would never do today, but I did. And I brought it down to her place on Green Street downtown. And I wheeled it into the garage, and she was really happy. And she said, wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. Now you can take it back to the studio and cast it into fiberglass for me. But first, we celebrate. And she took out a bottle of whiskey and opened the bottle of whiskey. It was 11 o'clock in the day. And we spent the next few hours drinking whiskey and crawling over her wonderful treasures and talking about her life. And I have to tell you that I have no memory of the drive back to my studio with her sculpture in the back of my truck, which is a terrifying thought, but I made it, obviously, because I'm here. And here's a shot of the finished sculpture in fiberglass. So I'll never forget her. She was a hell of a sculptor. female figure with star. When she drew that piece on the studio wall, as before she swept out, she turned to me and she said, "I always knew I'd be a star." Unforgettable. My father had the opportunity to work at the Metropolitan Museum in the reproduction studio, and he went to the Met for 6 months, and I kept the studio running. And then he said, "You know, Vanessa, this is a really exciting place, and it's a very exciting time with Thomas Hoving at the helm, and the treasures of Tutankhamun are happening, and they're sending me to China and Beijing and all these wonderful places. I really think that you should come here." And the notion of a steady paycheck was irresistible. So I closed the studio and joined my father at the Met. And we worked together there in the reproduction studio for 5 years. And it was an exciting time. We went from the scale of the de Kooning enlargements and these large pieces to working on obviously tiny, tiny jewelry size pieces. And as I was working on original objects, our job was to make molds of them for both reproduction and also for curatorial study. I remember spending hours under a magnifying glass preparing the surface of the original, and I kept thinking, you know, kid, you've got 2-part epoxy and a compressor and silicone rubber, and all these people had was time. So stop complaining, and just, whenever I would get cranky, I'd say, just get back to work. But it was an absolute thrill to be able to handle the original artworks and examine them so closely, to become so intimate with them. Just another version of, it was a particularly fun piece working on a 16th century ivory box. But after 5 years at the Met, I got pretty restless. I felt disconnected from the art world, the world of the students that we taught at Pratt, and the everyday artists that would come in with wonderful problems to solve, because a museum environment is a very different environment. And I just talked to my dad and said, you know, I really want to be back in the studio. And so we left the Met after 5 years and opened up the studio in Long Island City again. And then one day the phone rang, and a friend of ours said, "We have this job coming up and we'd like you to be part of it." It was 1985, and the Statue of Liberty was being restored in advance of its 100th year anniversary. So a year before the centennial anniversary, the restoration started. And it was in several parts. The bulk of the work was to repair the inner armature that had corroded over being, 100 years out in the marine environment. What you're looking at is the largest freestanding scaffold in the world. And by freestanding, I mean that Augustus Bartholdi designed the sculpture, and Gustav Eiffel designed the interior armature. And it was a masterpiece of engineering. Think about in the 1800s to do this work. Gustav Eiffel designed the Statue of Liberty so that it would move 8 inches in any direction because of the wind. And as a result, the scaffolding that had to be erected for the restoration couldn't touch the sculpture at any point. The Statue of Liberty's skin is the thickness of 2 US pennies. It's hammered copper, known as repoussé. So there had to be a large space all around the sculpture surface, and the scaffolding went down to the ground. It didn't touch the sculpture at any point. Fortunately, I was used to working on scaffolding, so that was not an issue for me. But this composite image shows the scope of the work that I did. The water had frozen and thawed and frozen and thawed over the 100 years, and it had punctured holes in the tip of the nose, the eye, corner of the hair. and our job was to repair those damages. So what we did was we went up and we made flexible rubber molds on the damaged areas. We cast plaster positives of those areas, took them back to our studio, remodeled the surface where the blemishes were, and then we made new molds. And it was into the new molds that the copper was hammered. The repoussé was hammered by the coppersmiths, so that you can see the mold going on, the bad bit coming out of the nose, the mold of the eye, and then the new copper replacement part. The thing that absolutely blew my mind, I grew up in New York City, and I had never gone to the Statue of Liberty. She was just always there. So I wasn't really prepared for the scale of it when the Coast Guard cutter came at 6 o'clock in the morning and picked us up at the dock and took us out, and it just got larger and larger and larger and larger. It was extraordinary to think that the craftspeople that worked on this over 100 years ago, everything was done by hand. Every single form and curve and change in direction was a separate piece of copper held together by rivets, suspended on a custom-made interior armature that was then lashed to this vertical pylon by Gustav Eiffel. It was just an extraordinary bit of engineering. So this image shows the preparation of the mold for the nose. And you can see the space between the scaffold and the sculpture. I said to my crew, you know, it's okay if you curse and sputter and spit and spew, but nobody's allowed to say oops, and nobody did. And this is the rubber mold being reinforced with burlap. And then a plaster mother mold was made over it. We removed the plaster shell, and when I took the molds back to the studio, I cast plasters. There you can see the extent of the blemish. I covered the hole itself with duct tape, as sounds so awful, but it did the job and it didn't hurt the surrounding patina. Around the back of the head was a very large hole at the bottom of the curl of the hair. And this is taking the rubber mold off. And this is after the coppersmiths had put back the new copper. We heard a lot of times, oh, we're paying all this money to get a newly restored statue, and how come it's not going to be shiny copper? It was never designed to be shiny copper. The copper oxidizes over time, and copper is one of those alloys that becomes self-skinning, where the oxide stops. You have oxidation on steel, which we call rust, and oxidation on silver, which we refer to as tarnish. Those are corrosive and need to be removed over time. But the copper roofs that you see all around the city and on buildings and on the Statue of Liberty, when it reaches that layer of green, it becomes self-skinning and it stops. And it's actually its own protective layer. So after the coppersmiths put in the new copper, a patinist went onto the sculpture and matched the patina. When the Statue of Liberty was made, what we all came to know as the torch was put in place. But the reason the torch looks like that is because at that time, in 1865, they had run out of money. Augustus Bartholdi's original design was to actually have a flame that was covered with 24-karat gold leaf, but they didn't have the money, and they came up with the solution that most of us grew up with. But when the money was raised for the restoration, they went back to the original drawings by Bartholdi, and the French team that came over and spent a year working on the sculpture, physically made a new model for the torch as per the original design. That's what you see down on the ground. It was made of plaster. And then it was wooden molds were made over the plaster model, and into the plaster, into the wooden molds, a new repoussé hammered copper was made, and then it was covered with 24-karat gold leaf as per the original design. And the torch that we all grew up with the leaded glass and the panes, that's living along with the molds and the plasters that I made. I believe they set up a museum at the base of the Statue of Liberty, and those can be seen as part of its restoration history. And this crazy thing happened. Throughout the whole restoration project, there was a photographer who covered every aspect of the restoration. And about 2 months before the centennial celebrations, he called me. He was very excited. And he told me that the French government had purchased 100 of his images, and they were issuing commemorative stamps for all of their protectorates, and that I was on, or the side of my head was on a postage stamp for a French protectorate. And I was like, oh, so like, am I going to be Miss Martinique? And he said, no, it's Liberia. I was like, okay. So here I am, the side of my head, the back of my head on a Liberian postage stamp. And I mean, that's pretty neat. I'm not dead and I'm on a postage stamp. So if you ever go to Liberia and you want to send a postcard, please send mine. So that's my claim to fame. But it was all joking aside, it was the thrill of my life to be part of that team, knowing I was in a place where no one, certainly in my lifetime, will be again. And it was a tremendous honor. So we have all of these old school things that I grew up with and have been trained on, and artists are the great experimenters. They're always pushing the boundaries and pushing the envelope. And in the 80s, when the digital technologies filtered through, they always start with the Defense Department and they go down into medicine, and then they come into industry. And the artists started to grab hold of these and started to utilize the three-dimensional modeling programs and the computer imaging processes and the digital technologies. And there was a period of time there when everyone was saying, oh, the hand arts are dead and this is going the way of the dinosaur. And while that was true for a period of time, I can tell you, being in the trenches, working with artists today and students, that there's a lot of people out there making things with their hands. So the pendulum has swung, and I'm happy about that. The way I see the digital technologies is that they are not replacing the hand arts, the handcrafts, but they're just another tool in the bag, and they should all be employed. I worked for 17 years at Tallix foundry after my father had retired, and a young woman came in, and what she had was this paper model. That was her idea, and she had a commission to make a very large sculpture that was going down to Florida. So we scanned and digitized it, and the digital data powered a water jet cut milling machine, a water jet machine that then cut the pieces out of aluminum, and we assembled them and then painted them. So it started out as a 10-inch paper model and was born to the artist's vision as a full-scale painted aluminum sculpture, which is still in Miami to this day, looking quite good. Frank Stella was one of the first artists that I was aware of that started experimenting with the digital technologies in the 80s. And he's still experimenting. I think he's 87 or 88 now, and he's still pushing the envelope and still just saying, I mean, he would come into the foundry and say, well, what happens if we pour this alloy on that? What happens if we pour stainless steel on aluminum? And we would say, we didn't know, but we were willing to find out. And a lot of stuff blew up and a lot of stuff ended up on the floor. And with each failure came another success, and we just learned together. And he pushed us and we pushed back, and we all grew together. And it was a wonderful time of experimentation and lots of smoke. And Frank would come in, and he originally made this series of models out of paper. And my task was to enlarge them and come up with a vocabulary for him. I would make big tables full of wax patterns and paper patterns and splashes of this, and he would use it or not and built the enlargements in this way. And it was a very, very exciting time. So this was done around 1986, and fast forward to just very recent, those sculptures that were hanging on the wall in the previous two slides have been living in his studio for all of these years. And it was time to freshen them up and just give them a good cleaning. And for me, it was like seeing old friends, and it brought back wonderful memories of that innovative exploration that we did together. The pieces in the background on the right, the beige looking pieces, are three-dimensionally printed models. Frank designs his sculptures working with an assistant using a three-dimensional modeling program. And these shapes that come of it I don't think they could be made any other way. They're physically printed from the inside out. And then, so he has this finished work. So he was looking at them for months and months and decided that he wanted to see them plated in different alloys. Working with the platers over the many years, they're used to working on small objects of a simple geometry. And fortunately for us, the cowboy platers that I worked with in Brooklyn were willing to experiment. They didn't know what was going to happen. They didn't even know how to quote the work. But they rolled up their sleeves and gave it a try. And Frank is a very generous and gracious experimenter. He knows when people are pushing the envelope for him, and he's very relaxed about it. Some artists make this look like that, and it's got to be precise and perfect. And Frank is not that way at all. He's the opposite. He really embraces the screw-ups and accidents and happy things that come along, because it opens up a whole nother idea for him when things blow up or they change shape midstream. So it's a very freeing and exciting way to work with an artist. So he wanted one gold-plated and silver-plated and black nickel. And the fellows at the plating shop said, well, we only can plate things in black nickel about this size. Well, I guess we'll have to build a bigger tank. And they did. And it was tremendously successful. There's the gold plating and the silver plating. And they're just beautiful objects. My favorite is the black nickel. It's just mysterious and very sexy. And so all of my life, I've been working with artists. And we were always talking about materials and process, and we're always talking about our hands, because that's our primary agent of creativity. And we're always talking about arthritis and who's seeing what doctor and who's wearing what brace and how many aspirins did you take. And it was always in the forefront and always in the background. My father passed away in 1997, and I went to his studio to do the tidying up of a life of art that you have to do. And I found this life casting in bronze that he had made of his hand. And I knew exactly what happened. He found a bucket of alginate and he plunged his hand into it just as an experiment. He pulled this massive stone carving paw out and said, interesting. And he sent it off to the foundry for casting in bronze. He came back from the foundry and he said, and he put it, when I found it, it had no patina on it, and it was literally sitting in a bucket under the bench, which was, of course, what my father would do. And he went on to the next job. But I had this bronze casting of this hand I knew so well, and I had it on my workbenches for years. And of course, I cherished it, but I really started looking at it in a different way, because I looked at that thickened arthritic wrist, and I would look at my own wrist and say, I got this thickened arthritic wrist. And I started looking at my own hands and all the scars and blemishes on it. And I started thinking about all these incredible makers that we had the fortune to work with over so many years, and how the discussion of our hands was always in the mix. At the end of a day, we would sit around and complain about our arthritis. So that's how the idea of the American Artists Hand Archive was born. I thought it would be an important thing to document as a life casting in bronze, the hands of the makers who have contributed so much to our culture, but at the same time, their chosen material impacted their hands in different ways, depending upon the material. So I made a rough list of all the makers, and the first person I called was Jasper Johns, because I'd done work with him for 30 years. And when I told him about the idea of creating this document, an archive, not single castings, not about fame, not about just recording the impact on the maker's hands, he simply said, good idea. Come on over. This was a sculpture that I reproduced for him. This was probably, I think this was the first sculpture I did for him. He had smeared aluminum modeling paste on a canvas, and he stuck a real life postage stamp in the corner. And this was around the Statue of Liberty time, because the task was to make a mold over this very fragile, delicate surface and make a reduction. You can make enlargements, you can make reductions. And the reduction, which was about 9 inches by 7 inches, was to be cast in sterling silver and given as a gift to those people who had donated significantly to the restoration of the Statue of Liberty. So this was a challenging piece because of it was fragile, and there was this real life postage stamp stuck on, but it was successful. And when I peeled the rubber away and I saw that the stamp was still intact, I realized that my career was intact as well. And Jasper was very pleased, and I went on to do all of his castings in different alloys for the next, 30 years or so. But he just is a master at materials and texture and details. And he figured out a way to transfer newsprint into wax. Just extraordinary work. So when I went to his studio to mold his hand, I brought my father's hand with me that day, because he knew my father, of course. And he looked at my father's hand and he looked at his hand, and we talked about our arthritis as we did. Jasper chose to just do one hand. When I talk to the artists about participating in the archive, I invite them to choose a gesture that's interesting to them. And sometimes it's very impromptu. Jasper just put up his hand and said, I think I'll just do the one hand, because to do both hands would imply that I was doing nothing. I said, okay. And as far as the patina goes, I either either the artist has input or I choose something. It's an instinctive thing that I do. And I didn't ask him about the patina. He's a gray guy, so I chose silver nitrate. And he was very pleased with it. But the silicone rubber that's used for life casting is exceptional in its ability to pick up detail. So at this moment in time, there are 34 completed bronzes in the archive. And the names that you see on the screen represent people that I've worked with for years. There are some names that are very, very well known and others that are not so well known. But these are incredible makers, wood carvers, stone carvers, painters, visual artists. This is my world that I reached out to. Of course, one could incorporate musicians or any of the makers, weavers, and that will probably happen as the archive grows. The next person I called was Robert Indiana. I had done a series of sculptures for him in the 80s, and he was wonderfully eccentric. When I called him, he remembered me right away, and I told him about the archive, and he said, "I'd be delighted, but do you know where I live?" And I was like, "Well, yeah." He's 15 miles off the coast of Maine on Vinyl Haven. And I said, "Well, let me ask you a question, Bob. Do you get milk delivered and the New York Times there?" And he said, "Well, of course." And I said, "Then don't worry, I'll get to you." And I took the ferry out to his house and spent a wonderful day going through his treasures. And by the time we finally got to the mold making part, he was a little tired, and of having the rubber smeared on his hand, he just said, "This is really icky." But he was a good sport about it, and he was really pleased with the detail of the casting. And that's what a life well lived as a maker at 80, 88 or 89 looks like. He also chose to just do the one hand. Kenneth Snelson, a dear friend and an incredible sculptor, makes fabricated sculptures. Many of you might know his work that's at Storm King or outside near the Air and Space Museum in Washington. Kenneth chose to hold a measuring stick that he used. It was a calibrated stick in aluminum that helped him scale up his paper models to larger sizes. And while I was molding his hand, he told me this horrific story of a botched surgery on his thumb, which rendered his thumbnail just mangled. And he said, "Don't you manicure that thumb. I've worked very hard for that thumb." And I certainly did not manicure it. When I called Beverly Pepper and told her about the archive, she said, "I do everything with my hands. I cook, I weld, I sew. Did I tell you I weld? Nobody's ever asked me to do this before. How can I help you?" And I just said, I just need you to sit for a few minutes, well, more than almost an hour, and just sit still. So the idea of asking these hands that are always moving to be still and vulnerable for this period is also a tremendous measure of trust and respect. And while I had her encased in rubber, I asked her if she could think of a single trait that would be important as an artist to thrive, to survive. And I thought for sure she was going to say tenacity. And she said courage. And those words stay with me in my heart to this day. She put her hands together in this pose and she just simply said, "This is my default position when I'm thinking." Judy Pfaff is an artist who loves process, materials, process. And it was all I could do to keep her hands still for the few moments that it took the rubber to set. I mean, she was just playing with the rubber, and I was like, "Judy, you have to stay still for just a little bit. It was successful. And when I brought the two bronze hands unpatinaed to her studio to talk about patina, she pointed to her boot and said, "Can you do this?" And I said, "Yes." And the patina, when my son saw the image that I took of this patinaed bronze, he said, "Mom, that looks like something you'd see in the Hubble Space Telescope." And Judy loved it. And everyone that sees this wild patina says, "That's Judy." Eric Fischel chose a gesture that was more about the final form. He was interested in the final form more than a gesture per se. And having done so many of his bronze sculptures for him over the years, I just told him that I would do the patina similar to the patinas he'd guided me through on his figurative pieces. And when I texted him a picture of the patina in progress, he texted back and said, "Wonderful, more drippy." So I made it more drippy. Huma Baba is an artist, a sculptor that works in so many different materials, primarily cork, wood, clay, found objects, bone. And of her, when I asked her about a gesture for her hands, she said simply, "I love texture. I love to feel it." And she just extended her hands in this way. Lucy Kim is one of the youngsters in the group. I think she's just maybe around 50. And her work is so interesting to me in that she takes materials that are so familiar, rubber, plaster, pigments, and she stops them at unexpected times and turns them into something else or goes down a different path. And at that moment in the studio, she just picked up a piece of string and said, "Can you do this?" And I said, "Yes." And it was just a beautiful gesture. It was technically challenging, but I was able to mold it and cast the string in bronze as well. I'm going to go back to the first image because when I brought the bronze to her, I welded the bronze underneath her fingers, but left the rest of the bronze string loose, and they just sit in the palms of her hand and onto the wrist. And she picked up the end and she flexed it a little bit, and the bronze string going against the hollow bronze casting made a sound. And she said, "Oh my goodness, that's so unexpected. It's like my work." And we had this beautiful moment. So all of these wonderful things happen during the whole process. While I'm recording the artists in rubber and then in bronze, I also talk to them about the life of their hands, and it goes off on tangents or not, but those discussions, and that's all part of the American Artists Hand Archive documentation. It's part of the document of these great makers. Titus Kaffar thought about his incredible hands. He's a gifted painter. I met him as a sculptor at the Foundry, and then I was introduced to his paintings, which are extraordinary. And he told me that his friends often teased him about the unorthodox way he holds his pencil. So he chose this piece. And again, another artist whose primary tool, in addition to his hands, is a pencil. The bronze casting was very successful. And the extraordinary photography that's done by the archives photographer, Mark Lacko, this has always been one of my favorite photographs, showing the tension and the depression, and it's just so beautiful. I brought Titus the bronze hand, and he was with his family that day. His mother was there and his children, and his young son picked up the bronze of his father's hand, and he said, "Daddy, it's just like holding your hand." It was another moment. Toshio Odate, to refer to Toshio as a wood carver is doing him a tremendous disservice. He's a master wood carver, classically trained by his master in Japan. He started his apprenticeship when he was 15 years old. He's 92 now. He was 90 when I recorded his hands. And when I asked him about the gesture, he went to his steel blade that he uses to carve his wood. Toshio doesn't use sandpaper. When he finishes a work, he finishes it with this blade, which is sharpened to a degree that I don't know how to describe to you. But when he picked up the blade and put it against the sharpening stone and his hands locked into that position, I was completely struck by the muscle memory that this man had. And he was holding that blade since he was 15 years old, just like that, 20, 30 times a day. And I said, Toshio, you would do this in your sleep. And he looked at me and he said, this is my biography. This is my identity. So he chose to have his hands holding the blade against the stone as his gesture, as his composition. Problem was the stone. I learned that this stone, which is priceless to him, comes from a lake in Kyoto, and it's irreplaceable. And the fineness of this surface is so fine, I was afraid that the mold rubber might blemish it, mar it in some way. So I covered the stone in foil and molded his hands in the round against the stone. And this was a first for the archive. I took the stone and had it digitally scanned and printed. The black is the black plastic version of the stone. I checked the print, the digital print, against the wax at the foundry. And then once both pieces were cast in bronze, the finished work looks like this.
Vanessa, I'm intruding, and I am very hesitant to intrude because I'm completely gobsmacked. Okay, completely engrossed. But my feeling is there will be some people, including Helaine, who might want to address questions or comments to you, and we should reserve a little bit of time for that.
Good, I'm done. I'm going to just do
Okay.
this. We end up, this is what's happening today. As you mentioned in the beginning, Helaine, the 34 bronze life castings are on display in Tarrytown, and they'll be on view through the end of December. And I'm really excited and hope that some of you will be able to see the work there. And I'm going to stop talking now. Good timing, Doug.
A quick comment, which is about half of that list that you displayed are artists who have appeared at Artist Talk on Art over the years. Eric, Judy, etc. And they're all in our archive, which is at Archives of American Art of the Smithsonian. Some during the audio, like Eric would have been during the audio only period, which ended in 1990. And then many others, and many of them were in the early part. The other thing I was going to say is Ken Snelson I interviewed, and just the preparation for that was very engrossing. Visiting his studio with all the maquettes, he would build out of very delicate materials, and
like Santa's workshop.
Right, and I was really wanting to get him to talk about Buckminster Fuller and his relationship with him at Black Mountain College and beyond. And he was very sensitive about that, but I did manage to draw him out on Fuller. Which was, like the tension integrity of his work.
Right.
The relationship.
And is that part of the interview,
Yes,
something I can look up and see? Because I
Yes.
did go through, oh, wonderful, because I know that was a touchy subject for him.
oh, yeah.
Vanessa, one of the participants asked if you would show the information about the exhibit again.
Sure.
Mhm.
Back to that. Yeah.
The David Rockefeller Creative Arts Center is brand new. It's only 1 year old. So when you go on the Pocantico website, it's a little hard to find, but I talked to Miriam before about possibly putting up the link to the show for you. So I don't know if she can do that, but you can tell me how I can email that to you, so it just makes it easy to find.
Yeah.
So that's where it is. It's in Tarrytown. The gallery regular hours are Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. You have to reserve a time ticket, but it's very relaxed, casual thing. It's just that they have a small staff, and it's an easy thing. It's free. What else can I tell you about the structural part of the exhibit? Is it something you're able to put
Is
up?
there a website for it?
Yes.
I'm
There
trying,
is.
Vanessa.
So if you go to Pocantico, then it takes you into events and exhibits and portraits of processes living in there. Not that easy to find, so it's a little frustrating because it's people say, oh, do you have an exhibit at Kaikit? Do you have an exhibit? Pocantico or the Pocantico Hills. Pocantico is the estate, Kaikit is the home, and the new David Rockefeller Creative Arts Center is the quiet secret that's just 1 year old now. And that's where, did you find it?
Yeah, I have a question about the display, the exhibition itself. Are you including the texts, discussions, some of the discussion that you have with the artists with the display of their hands?
At this moment, I haven't done that. I'm trying to be there as often as I can. I'm generally there on Saturdays. That part would have required a lot more preparation than we had time for with QR codes. And we just really, I wanted people to experience the bronzes, not from a fame point of view, but I just wanted people to experience the bronzes as the shared humanity that we all have, the common humanity of our hands as these primary agents. But those conversations and stories are being recorded, and I'm getting them down, but they're not in the exhibit itself.
Here,
Is there a book either by you or by your father, or a book about the history of Tallix or of the family?
I'm working on that right now.
Bravo.
Vanessa, I have a question for you.
Yes,
When
Leah.
you began your presentation, you used a term that I hear rarely in the world of sculpture. You said heroic,
Yes.
not monumental.
Uh-huh.
And working as a sculptor myself and being behind the scenes, I can say the real heroes are people like yourself and your father, who the artist's dream and convert it to something absolutely heroic. How did you choose the difference of the words?
You know, you exhale what you inhale, and I'm 70 years old, and I started when I was 16, and those were the terms that people like Walker Hancock and Donald DeLue and Marshall Fredericks used to describe over life-size pieces. So that's what I relate to, heroic in scale. And I didn't even think about it, Leah. So interesting that you brought that up. I say things and I'm not even aware of them. So
Where are you located?
I live in New Paltz. I live in the Hudson Valley in New Paltz, New York. I grew up in New York City and just made a very slow, when my dad retired, he went out to the West Coast and I worked with Dick Polich at his foundry upstate. So that's when I moved upstate 25 years ago.
But is the foundry's name changed now?
Yes, yes. Dick Polich died about a year ago, and an Australian company bought it called UAP, United. What does it stand for? United Art Project, something like that. They deal mainly in large scale fabricated works, not so much the life size and under pieces anymore. Working with those craftspeople for so many years, and as is the way of the world, many of the young people go off and start foundries of their own. And the two fellows that I worked with, who were my go-to guys, really skilled guys, in fact, started their own foundry about 8 years ago, Workshop Art Fabrication. They're located in Kingston. And they took all the good lessons and left the nonsense at the door, and they have a beautiful foundry of about 20 people. And they do fine, fine work. So they're well trained, and it's not for the faint of heart, though. Starting a foundry.
Vanessa, the exhibit information? Are you
Yes.
seeing? Okay. Is there something else to see other than this page?
No, when you go to the website and you click on the reserved tickets, then that takes you there. There have been press releases, and just yesterday, a pretty handsome article came out in the Hudson Valley paper called something.
Chronogram
So,
or
no, not the chronogram. The chronogram just gave us one little listing. I'm sorry, I'm blanking on
Hudson
that.
Valley one?
No, I'll tell you in a moment. So we're starting to get a little bit of press, and the exhibit will be on through the end of December. And I think that as the word gets out, I'm hopeful that there'll be more attention.
Mhm.
And in the meantime, there's a sense of urgency to the work, because these masters are aging and people
Right.
die. And while I'm still very much focusing on recording the hands of other people. Just yesterday, I had the glorious experience of working with John Pay.
Mhm.
John Pay was the head of the fine arts department at Pratt for 40 something years. He's
Yeah,
88 years old. Do you know him, Helaine?
Yeah, he
Yeah,
was there
sure.
right when I was there.
Absolutely. And I recorded his hands yesterday.
But I'm not that
and it
old.
was-
How many more do you have to go? How many more?
until I don't know. It's an ongoing endeavor.
Mhm.
And they are
Is-
works of art in themselves, I must say. They're just fabulous.
Thank you.
These pieces are so emotional and sensitive that each one of them just touches you.
Thank you so much.
It's so fantastic.
Oh, look at all these people.
Yeah. I think this is a good moment for me to take a moment and to thank both Vanessa Hoheb and Helaine Soller, and of course our audience, but I would also like to thank Miriam Deutsch, who is our programming director, Jacqueline Rada, who helped to inspire this moment and is a board member and artist. And I was going to say that artists over the years that we've come in contact with are always asking, always wanting to know how to make it big in the art world. Well, now they know.
I was just going to say that's the $1 million question, right?
Right.
But
right.
yeah, it's a time-honored technique. The digital technologies help us get there faster, but at the end of the day, you still need to breathe the life back into it.
Uh-huh.
Some artists,
Certainly those that worked with you and your dad and all the staff of the foundry, they were in very good hands.
well, it was a two-way street. To be in if you think, well, you all know, I mean, you take something that you've been working on for 2 months, 2 years, 20 years, and you hand it over to a technician, and they take it into this very industrial place or a very
Right.
industrial process, and it really is a relationship issue and a trust issue, and that's something I've worked very hard on all of my career.
Right.
Um,
So
and
thank you
it's been
so
very
much.
rewarding and
Thank you so
wonderful
much
to
for
talk to
sharing
you
your,
all.
sharing
You've
yourself
also,
and
what
this history,
I'm sorry.
both of you.
What I meant to say is that Vanessa teaches as well, and has taught at Pratt and Marcus College as well. So it's she is giving not only to the history of art and artists in the form of her archive, but also to the next generation. And I was just wondering about the next generation and the apprenticeship processes. Is it still is it vital? Is it growing? Is it?
Are you asking me?
Yes, Vanessa.
Well, I just lectured at the School of Visual Arts the other night, and the overriding lesson that I wanted to share with these young artists who worked in different disciplines, film and fine arts, and was, the question is, how do you make a living in the art world? And the short answer is you don't. So
Right.
you have to pay the bills. Money's the grease on the wheel of life. It's annoying, but that's the reality. And so if you and our families as artists, either it seems to be one way or the other, they either kind of placate us and say, well, they don't really understand what we do, or on the other end of the stick, it's like, when are you going to get a real job? So I was just telling these young people that how do you, going back to what Jacques Lipschitz said to my father, if you have the discipline of ego to be able to work for another artist or another print shop or a fabricator so that you can learn these skills, become valuable to other artists in that way. Artists have had assistance since day one, whether it's helping them with the administrative part or mixing plaster or getting a model up in space. If you have the sensitivity and you keep your antenna up and your mouth shut, and if you can be the hands with no fingerprints for someone else, you'll be paid tenfold in the opportunities, the networking, what you learn. And for me, it was a viable path, and I see it as a viable path for young artists if they have that discipline. And I said to them, if you don't, it's not a judgment. You just have to find another game. You just have to find another way to make a living. But to be immersed and surrounded by other creative people while you're playing the scales all day is a pretty wonderful way to make a living and be surrounded by it. So I just,
Good advice.
and I also just, I have to say this because it's on my mind. So I also said to them, it's really, really important to nurture. I mean, the reason we're here all talking to each other right now is because of the relationships we all have with each other, with Helaine, with all of you. You all know each other, and here you are, right? And I said to them, you have to nurture your tribal relationships and nurture them and be generous with your time and your knowledge and your resources, and know that that will come back to you tenfold. Maybe not right away, but at some point down the line, someone's going to say, oh yeah, when I called Vanessa and she told me the recipe for this, she helped me, and now Vanessa needs help. And that's how we survive as artists.
Can I ask you a question? Are you still, I'm sorry, I'm Babs Reingold talking here. Are you, you're still working with artists at this point, or you're not?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I am. I oversee the work of Mary Frank. I work as her studio assistant. I work overseeing Frank Stella's casting work, Richard Prince. So I work independently doing that. And when the phone rings, I have work with them. And when it doesn't, I don't. So it's a mixed bag, and it's wonderful, because I quit the foundry 8 years ago to devote myself to the Hands Archive, because I didn't want it to be a stolen moments project. I knew that if it was ever going to achieve what I wanted it to be, I had to devote myself full time to it.
It's a fantastic project.
Thank you.
And I,
We need to say goodnight though. And I need to thank everybody again, especially Vanessa and
Thank
Helaine
you, Doug.
and
Thank you
everyone
for
who
being
attended.
the hook.
Yeah, okay. Until
just want to
next
ask
time.
if we can
Till
reach
next time.
out. Can we
Thank
reach
you
out?
so much.
Absolutely. If you share my email, if
you
you
do
don't already
that?
have that.
What
It's
is-
my name at gmail.com. Vanessa Hoheb
Vanessa
at
Hoheb
Gmail.
at gmail.com.
And
Okay.
keep the tribal thing happening.
Get a
Okay.
man.
Thank you all.
Thank
Okay,
you, Doug.
thank you.
Thank
Thank
I'll
you
get
so
the hook
much.
now.
Thank you for
Thank
a
you.
great evening,
Good
everyone.
night.
Take care. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank
It
you.
was
Okay.